The dust of Redemption Bluff tasted like every other failure, gritty, final, and coating the back of her throat. Opal led her mare, Daisy, through the main street, the weight of her husband's saddle pressing into her own shoulder. It was a lie, of course, not the husband part. Thomas had been real enough. A kind man with soft hands who knew books, not horses. He had coughed his last into a bloody rag 2 weeks ago, leaving her with nothing but his name and a wagon they couldn't afford. The saddle, however, was her father's. It was the only thing of value she hadn't sold. The last piece of a life before Thomas, a life of sweat and hay and the quiet language of horses. Every eye in the small town followed her. A woman alone was a curiosity. A woman in a worn dress, leading a tired horse and carrying a man's heavy saddle, was a story they were already writing in their heads. She ignored the whispers that followed her like flies. She had walked the last 20 miles after the wagon's axle broke for the final time. Her destination was a name she'd heard from a weary traveler heading east, Calloway. A man who owned a ranch so vast it was its own small kingdom. A man who might have work for someone who wasn't afraid of it. The Calloway Ranch spread out under a wide, unforgiving sky, a collection of sturdy buildings that looked like they had grown from the earth itself. The main house was imposing, 2 stories of dark timber with a porch that wrapped around it like a fortress wall. Men moved with purpose in the corrals, their movements economical and sharp. It smelled of horse and leather and hot iron from the smithy. It smelled like home, a ghost of a home she hadn't known in years, and the ache in her chest was so sharp it nearly buckled her knees. A man with a mean squint and a tobacco-stained beard intercepted her before she took 3 steps into the main yard. His name was Jed, she would learn, and he was the foreman. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on the saddle she carefully lowered to the ground. "This ain't a charity," he grunted. "Whatever you're sellin', we ain't buyin'." "I'm not selling," Opal said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm looking for work. I can handle horses." Jed let out a short, ugly laugh. A few of the nearby hands stopped their work to watch, smirking. "Lady, we got men for that. Best you move on. Go see the preacher's wife. Maybe she needs some laundry done." "I handle horses," she repeated, planting her feet. It was all she had, her one truth wrapped in a necessary lie. "My husband taught me everything he knew." A voice, low and resonant as a distant storm, cut through the dusty air. "What kind of horses?" The man who spoke stood on the porch of the main house, his frame silhouetted against the dark wood. He descended the steps slowly, his boots making no sound in the thick dust until he was closer. He was tall, with shoulders that strained the fabric of his plain shirt. His face was all harsh angles and shadows under the brim of his hat, but it was his eyes that held her. They were the color of a winter sky, and they missed nothing. This had to be Calloway. "Any kind," Opal answered, meeting his gaze. "The stubborn ones, the ones who've been ruined by a heavy hand." Jed scoffed. "She's talking nonsense, boss." Calloway didn't look at his foreman. His attention was fixed on Opal, a current of silent assessment passing between them. He gestured with his chin toward the far corral, where a powerful gray gelding was fighting 2 men, bucking and screaming with a wild terror. "That one's a ghost. Threw 3 men this week. Broke Miller's arm yesterday. You handle him, you've got a job." It was a test meant to humiliate her. She knew it. The men knew it. But it was also an offer. She untied the worn blanket from her saddle and walked toward the corral, her heart pounding a rhythm of fear and defiance. The air was thick with the horses' panic and the men's scorn. She slipped between the rails, ignoring their warnings. The gray's eyes were wide, rolling white, his coat dark with sweat. He wasn't mean. He was terrified. She didn't approach him. She simply stood in the center of the corral, her hands loose at her sides, and she started to speak. Her voice was low and soft. the same tone her father had used, a gentle murmur that wasn't about words but about sound, about peace. She spoke of cool water and green grass, of a world without spurs and whips. The horse stopped its frantic circling, its head coming up, ears twitching toward the strange, calm sound. Slowly, cautiously, she took a step. He held his ground, trembling. She took another. She kept talking, her voice a thread of calm in his storm. It took the better part of an hour. The sun beat down, and the ranch hands fell silent, their mockery replaced by a stunned disbelief. Calloway remained where he was, a statue carved from shadow and stillness, watching her every move. Finally, she was close enough to reach out. Her hand moved with painstaking slowness, not toward his head, but toward his powerful shoulder. She let her fingers rest there, light as a moth. The horse flinched but did not bolt. A great shuddering sigh passed through him and his head dropped. She had him. She led the gray around the corral, her hand on his neck, her voice a constant, soothing presence. When she was done, she slipped back through the rails and walked back to where she had left her things. She was exhausted, drained to her very bones, but a flicker of hope had ignited within her. She picked up her saddle to place it on Daisy, who had been waiting patiently. That's when Calloway moved. He crossed the yard in a few long strides, his shadow falling over her. She looked up, expecting a dismissal, a grudging word of hire. But his face was a mask of iron, his eyes fixed not on her, but on the saddle in her hands. On the worn fender, tooled deep into the leather, was a small, unmistakable mark, a shield with a crossed saber and the number 7, the brand of the 7th Cavalry. His voice, when he spoke, was dangerously quiet. "Where did you get this saddle?" The lie came to her lips, practiced and brittle. "It was my husband's," she said, her throat tight. "He served. He taught me how to ride." Calloway's jaw tightened, a muscle flexing in the hard line of his cheek. He looked from the brand to her face, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch, searching for something he could not find. He knew the men of the 7th. He knew their names, their faces, the way they died. He knew this saddle, or ones just like it. He looked at her hands, slender but chapped and calloused. He looked at her eyes, which held a fear she was trying desperately to conceal. He gave a sharp, curt nod. "Jed," he called out, his voice cracking like a whip. "Find her a bunk near the house. She starts today." He turned and walked away without another word, leaving Opal standing in the dust, the weight of his suspicion far heavier than the saddle had ever been. She had the job, but she had also stepped into a new and more complicated danger. The bunk was little more than a closet attached to the back of the main house, but it had a door that latched and a cot with a thin mattress. It was more than she'd had in months. Jed showed her to it with a sneer, tossing a threadbare blanket onto the cot. "Don't get comfortable," he warned. "The boss might be a fool for a pretty face, but the rest of us ain't. One mistake, and you're gone." Opal didn't reply. She learned quickly that silence was her only armor. Her days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun. She was up before dawn, tending to the horses. She spent most of her time with the gray, whom she named Shadow. Under her patient hands, the horse's terror began to recede, replaced by a cautious trust. She never used force, only a quiet persistence that baffled the other hands. They watched her from a distance, their talk a low buzz of rumor and speculation. Calloway watched her too. She would feel his eyes on her from the porch of the main house as she worked with Shadow in the round pen. He never spoke to her, never approached. He was a constant, unnerving presence, his silence a judgment she couldn't decipher. He was powerful, but seemed encased in a shell of solitude. He took his meals alone in his study, and the only sounds from the main house were the lonely tread of his boots on the floorboards late at night. He was a man drowning in a silence of his own making. She saw the damage in him. It was in the way he held himself, a rigid control that never eased. It was in the haunted look in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. It was the same look she sometimes saw in the mirror. He was broken in a way she understood, and that recognition was a dangerous seed to plant in the barren soil of her heart. Her first real proving came a week after she arrived. A mare was having a difficult birth, her first foal, and it was breech. The vet was a day's ride away. Jed and 2 other men were struggling, the mare screaming and wild with pain. They were going to lose them both. "You'll kill her pulling like that," Opal said, stepping into the birthing stall. Jed rounded on her. "And what would you know about it, Mrs.? Did your dear dead husband teach you this too?" "Get out of my way," she said, her voice low and firm. She pushed past him, ignoring his furious sputtering. She began to speak to the mare, the same crooning murmur she used with Shadow, stroking the animal's sweat-soaked neck. The mare's frantic struggles eased slightly. "I need clean cloths and warm water. Now." To her surprise, one of the younger hands scrambled to obey. Opal rolled up her sleeves, her mind going back to her father's lessons, to the long nights in their own barn. She was small, but her hands were strong and sure. She worked quickly, her touch gentle but firm, repositioning the foal with a skill that was as innate as breathing. It was a long, bloody struggle, but finally, with a great rush, the foal was born, alive and whole. She was cleaning the newborn colt when Calloway appeared in the doorway of the stall. He hadn't been there a moment before. He moved with a soldier's quietness. He looked at the exhausted mare, now licking her foal. He looked at Opal, her arms slick with blood to the elbows, her face pale with exhaustion, but her eyes shining with a fierce pride. "Jed said you were interfering," he stated, his voice flat. "The foal was breech," she said simply, not looking at him. "They would have both died." She ran a cloth over the colt's slick back, her movements tender. He watched her for a long moment. She could feel his gaze on her, heavy and searching. "See that you get a proper meal tonight," he said, and then he was gone. It wasn't praise, not really, but it was an acknowledgement, a crack in the wall of his silence. That night, a tray was left outside her bunkhouse door. It held a thick slice of beef, roasted potatoes, and a piece of cornbread. It was the first hot meal she hadn't cooked herself over a meager fire in months. She ate it sitting on her cot, and for the first time since Thomas died, she allowed herself to cry, not from grief, but from a strange and painful flicker of gratitude. The slow burn began in the quiet moments, the spaces between the work. It was a language spoken not in words, but in nearness. One evening, she stayed late in the tack room, mending a bridle with a broken strap. The smell of leather and oil was a comfort, a familiar ghost. The hiss of the kerosene lamp was the only sound. The door creaked open, and Calloway stood there. She startled, her needle pricking her finger. "Mr. Calloway," she said, quickly putting her hand to her mouth. He ignored the title. "You work too late," he said. It wasn't a criticism, just a statement of fact. He walked over to the workbench, picking up a different piece of leather, a worn-out rein. He ran his thumb over the cracked surface. "There's a memory in old leather," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "The sweat of the horse, the grip of the man. It holds the story." "My father used to say that," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She had spoken without thinking. His eyes snapped to hers. "Your husband's father?" he asked, a subtle test. She felt a cold knot of fear in her stomach. "No, my own." She focused back on her mending, her hands trembling slightly. "He was a tanner for a time." Another half-truth to cover the first lie. He didn't press her. Instead, He pulled up a stool and began working on the old rein, his large, capable hands moving with a surprising grace. They worked in silence for nearly an hour, the only sounds the scrape of his tools and the pull of her thread. The shared quiet was more intimate than any conversation. In that small, lamplit room, he wasn't the powerful ranch owner and she wasn't the mysterious widow. They were just two people, mending what was broken. When she finally finished, she stood to leave. "Good night," she said softly. "Opal," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded different in his mouth, solid and real. She paused at the door, her back to him. "The stitches are clean," he said. "You do good work." She fled back to her bunk, her heart hammering against her ribs. Their fragile peace was shattered by the foreman. Jed's resentment had been festering, turning into a sour poison. He saw the respect Opal was slowly earning from some of the men, saw the quiet attention the boss paid her, and it galled him. He began to undermine her in small ways, misplacing her tools, leaving a gate unlatched. Opal knew it was him, but she said nothing, simply fixing what he broke and doubling her own vigilance. Then came the storm. Dark clouds had been gathering on the horizon for days, and the air grew thick and heavy with the promise of a violent downpour. Calloway had given strict orders to bring the prize stallion, a magnificent black named Midnight, into the main barn. Jed was tasked with it. An hour later, as the first drops of rain began to fall, a frantic shout went up from the stables. Midnight was gone. The gate to his paddock was swinging wide open. Jed was all blustering innocence. "The latch must have been faulty. I secured it myself." But Opal saw the flicker of malice in his eyes as he looked at her. This was his doing. He knew the stallion was high-strung and would run from a storm. Calloway's face was grim. "He'll head for the canyons. If the creek rises, we'll lose him." He started shouting orders, organizing a search party, but Opal didn't wait. She knew that horse. She knew the canyons. And she knew a storm like this waited for no man. While the others were scrambling for slickers and horses, she saddled Daisy, grabbing a rope. She rode out into the wind and gathering rain. A small, determined figure against a vast, angry landscape. She had to fix this. The rain came down in sheets, turning the dry ground to slick mud. The wind howled, tearing at her clothes. It was madness to be out, but she pushed on, her eyes scanning the broken land. She found Midnight's tracks near a narrow wash that would soon be a raging torrent. He was heading deeper into the canyons, just as she'd feared. She found him an hour later, trapped on a small spit of land as the creek rose around him. He was panicked, rearing and plunging, his eyes wild with terror. Getting a rope on him would be impossible alone. She was trying to figure out a plan when she heard another horse behind her. It was Calloway, his face a thunderous mask, his coat soaked through. "What in God's name are you doing out here alone?" he roared over the wind. "Do you have a death wish?" "Your horse was going to die," she yelled back, her voice raw. "Jed did this. He left the gate open." Calloway's eyes narrowed, but there was no time for accusations. "The bank is about to give way. We have to move now." Together, they worked. He was all strength and command. She was all instinct and horse sense. He managed to get a rope over the stallion's head, while she used Daisy to herd him from the side, speaking to him constantly, her calm voice cutting through his panic and the storm's fury. They got him onto higher ground just as the piece of earth he'd been standing on collapsed into the churning brown water. They were both soaked to the bone, shivering with cold and adrenaline. He dismounted and came over to her, his expression unreadable in the gray light. "You are the most reckless, stubborn woman I have ever met," he said, his voice rough. He reached up, and for a heart-stopping moment she thought he was going to strike her. Instead, he unbuttoned his heavy wool coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. The warmth of it, smelling of him and wet wool and rain, enveloped her. It was the kindest gesture she had known in years. His hands rested on her shoulders, his grip firm, steadying her. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice dropping. He was standing so close she could feel the heat of his body. She looked up into his face, into his storm-gray eyes, and saw something there beyond anger. It was a raw, aching fear. He had been afraid for her. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. The ride back was silent. The storm had broken, leaving behind a clean, rain-washed world. The heavy coat was a shield against the chill, a tangible sign of his protection. He rode close beside her, so close their knees sometimes brushed. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Something had shifted between them in the heart of the storm. A wall had been breached. When they got back to the ranch, he helped her dismount, his hands spanning her waist. His touch lingered for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, a spark of heat that shot through her. He took the reins of both their horses and led them to the barn, leaving her standing there, wrapped in his coat, her world tilting on its axis. The incident with the stallion changed things. Jed was given the coldest dressing down of his life in Calloway's office, the quiet fury of the boss's voice more terrifying than any shouting. After that, the foreman's hatred for Opal curdled into something uglier, but he was more careful. The other men, however, looked at her with a new respect. She had saved the ranch's most valuable horse. She had ridden into a storm that had kept seasoned hands in the barn. She had earned her place. Calloway began to seek her out, not just to watch, but to talk. He would appear in the stables while she was grooming Shadow, asking her opinion on a new filly or the quality of the hay. He was asking about horses, but she knew he was learning about her. He learned that she was literate, that she could do sums in her head faster than he could on paper. He discovered the sharp, strategic mind behind her quiet exterior. One afternoon, he found her in the paddock with a young foal that had a nasty gash on its leg from a piece of wire. He was about to send for the liniment, but she was already working, her hands gentle as she cleaned the wound with a poultice of herbs she had gathered from the riverbank. "Yarrow to stop the bleeding, plantain to draw out the poison," she explained without looking up, her focus entirely on the animal. "My mother taught me." "Your mother?" he asked, his voice laced with a careful curiosity. "I thought your husband taught you everything." Her hands stilled. She had slipped. The web of her lies was so tangled, she could barely keep it straight herself. "A person can have more than one teacher," she said, her voice tight. She risked a glance at him. He was watching her with that same unnerving intensity, the look that said he was piecing together a puzzle and didn't like the shape it was taking. The nights were the hardest. The loneliness of her small room was a physical presence. Nightmares plagued her, flashes of her past life, the creditors pounding on the door of her small house back east, their faces twisted with greed, the cold, final stillness of her husband Thomas in their bed, the long, desperate journey west. One night, a particularly vivid dream had her crying out, a strangled sob of pure despair. She woke with a gasp, her heart pounding, the sound of her own cry still echoing in the small space. She sat bolt upright, listening. The ranch was silent except for the chirping of crickets. But then she heard it. The soft creak of a floorboard on the porch of the main house, just outside her door. Someone was there. She held her breath, her body rigid with fear. Was it Jed? Had he come to hurt her? She waited, her ears straining, but there was only silence. After a long time, she heard the sound of a single pair of boots walking away, the lonely tread of the master of the house. The next morning, when she opened her door, a tin mug of steaming coffee sat on the threshold. It was black and strong, just the way he took his. She picked it up, the warmth seeping into her cold hands. She looked toward the main house, but there was no sign of him. He had heard her cry out. He had come to her door, stood guard in the dark, and left this small, silent offering of comfort. The gesture was so profound, so deeply felt, that it brought tears to her eyes. This closed-off, damaged man was capable of a tenderness that undid her completely. She was falling for him, and it terrified her more than any storm. The breaking point came on a hot, dusty Saturday, a week later. Calloway had ridden into town for supplies, leaving Jed in charge. The foreman had been drinking since noon, his temper growing fouler with every sip from his flask. He found Opal in the main barn, reshoeing Daisy. The other hands were nearby, mending tack and trying to stay out of the foreman's way. Jed swaggered into the barn, a sneer on his face. Well, well, look at the little widow, playin' blacksmith. He kicked at a bucket, sending it clattering across the floor. You think you've got everyone fooled, don't you? Come in here with your sad story and your fancy ridin'. Opal straightened up slowly, the hoof pick still in her hand. I'm just doing my job, Jed. Your job, he spat. Your job is to look pretty and bat your eyes at the boss. But some of us see right through you. He took a menacing step closer. No trail widow knows horses like that. It ain't natural. And that saddle. He pointed a grubby finger at her father's saddle, which sat on a nearby rack. That's a man's saddle, a soldier's saddle. I'll wager you stole it off some dead man on the trail. You're nothing but a thief and a liar. The accusation hung in the thick, dusty air. The other men had stopped working, their eyes wide. This was it. The public confrontation she had been dreading. Her secret was a fragile thing, and he was tearing at it with dirty hands. You don't know anything about me, she said, her voice shaking but firm. I know a grifter when I see one, he snarled, grabbing the saddle from the rack. He held it up for all to see. This here is proof. She's a damn liar. Put it down. The voice came from the barn doorway. It was Calloway. He had come back early. His face was like granite, his eyes chips of ice. He walked into the barn, and the other men seemed to shrink back from the cold fury radiating from him. Jed, fortified by whiskey, held his ground. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking, boss. She's lied to you from the day she got here. Ask her. Ask her where she really got this saddle. Ask her who her husband really was. He thrust the saddle toward Calloway. Make her tell the truth. The entire barn was silent. Every eye was on Calloway, waiting for his judgment. He had to choose. His reputation, the order of his ranch, against the word of a woman he barely knew, a woman he suspected of lying from the very start. Opal's heart sank. She saw the trap Jed had laid. Calloway was a man of honor and discipline. He would not tolerate a liar on his land. It was over. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the tightening of his jaw. He looked at the cavalry brand on the saddle, then at her, his gaze holding 1,000 questions. She could see the rational choice, the safe choice, warring with something else, something deeper. The weight of his decision pressed down on her, suffocating her. Before he could speak, she made the choice for him. She couldn't bear to be the cause of his dishonor, to be the lie that tarnished his name. He's right, she said, her voice a dead, hollow thing. I should go. She turned, dropping the hoof pick with a clatter, and walked out of the barn, not looking back. She didn't see the shock on Calloway's face, or the triumphant sneer on Jed's. She just walked, her back straight, her world crumbling to dust around her. She packed her few belongings in a haze of despair. The small bunk room, which had felt like a sanctuary, was now just a cage. She folded the blanket Calloway's housekeeper had given her, her hands clumsy with grief. She had been a fool to hope. The world was a hard place for a woman alone, and a sliver of kindness was not a foundation to build a life on. He would choose his ranch, his reputation, his orderly world. He would have to. She scribbled a short note on a piece of scrap paper. "Thank you for the work. I am sorry for the trouble." She left it on the cot, weighted down by the tin mug he had left for her. She took his coat, the one he had wrapped around her in the storm, from the hook on the wall. She folded it carefully and placed it on the cot as well. She couldn't take it with her. It was a warmth she hadn't earned, a promise that wasn't hers to keep. Saddling Daisy in the dim light of the stable felt like a final act of surrender. Every creak of the leather, every jingle of the harness was a sound of departure. She would ride east or west. It didn't matter. There was nowhere for her to go, but she couldn't stay. She led Daisy out into the yard, the moon a pale, indifferent witness in the sky. She took one last look at the main house, a dark silhouette against the stars. A single lamp burned in an upstairs window. His window. She imagined him in there, relieved, the problem of her existence now solved. The thought was a knife in her heart. She put her foot in the stirrup, ready to haul herself up and ride away into the darkness, back to being nothing and nobody. "You're not going anywhere." His voice came out of the darkness behind her. She froze, her foot still in the stirrup. Calloway stepped out from the shadows of the barn. He wasn't angry. His face, in the moonlight, was etched with a pain that mirrored her own. "I can't stay," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I won't be the lie that destroys you." "Then tell me the truth," he said, his voice low and urgent. He came to stand before her, blocking her path. "All of it. I've been piecing it together, but the parts don't fit. That brand. I knew a man who could gentle a horse with just his voice, a horse master in the 7th. He had a saddle just like that." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "His name was Quinn. Sergeant Thomas Quinn." The name, her father's name, spoken aloud by this man, shattered the last of her defenses. A sob escaped her, a raw, ragged sound. The truth came pouring out, a torrent of grief and fear she had held back for so long. "He was my father," she wept. "The saddle was his. My husband's name was also Thomas, Thomas Weller. He was a good man, a clerk from back east. He knew nothing of this life. When he died, his creditors came for everything. I ran. I had to. I sold everything but the saddle. It was all I had left of my father. I came west, hoping. I don't know what I was hoping. I used my husband's name. I let people believe he was the soldier because I was afraid. No one would give a woman a chance. They would think I stole it. Just like Jed said." Calloway listened, his expression unmoving, but a storm of emotion was raging in his eyes. Shock, recognition, and a deep, profound guilt. "Quinn," he breathed, the name an exhalation of old pain. "He saved my life. Outside Little Bighorn, we were in a scouting party, ambushed. He pulled me onto his horse, took a bullet that was meant for me." His voice grew thick. "I was the officer who led them into that canyon. I was young, arrogant. I got him killed. I've carried that for 10 years. He finally understood. Her skill, her quiet way with the horses, her father's saddle. It wasn't a lie. It was a legacy. She was Thomas Quinn's daughter. And he, Calloway, owed her a debt he could never repay. At that moment, the sound of drunken laughter came from the direction of the bunkhouse. Jed and 2 of his cronies were weaving their way across the yard, flasks in hand. They saw Opal and Calloway standing together. "Well, looky here." Jed slurred, a malicious grin spreading across his face. "Decided to give the boss one last goodbye, did you? Don't worry, lady. We'll see you on your way." He took a step toward her, his intentions clear. Calloway moved so fast he was a blur. He didn't draw his pistol. He didn't raise his voice. He simply placed himself between Opal and the drunken foreman. He was no longer the quiet, watchful rancher. He was the cavalry officer, a man of command and absolute authority. The transformation was terrifying and magnificent. "Jed," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying the deadly weight of cold steel. "You are fired. You and any man who stands with you. Pack your things and be off my land by sunrise. If I see your face here again, I will have you arrested for trespassing and assault." Jed's drunken courage evaporated in the face of Calloway's icy calm. He stammered, looking to his friends for support. But they were already backing away, their faces pale. Jed stared at Calloway, then at Opal, his face twisting with hatred. He spat on the ground and turned, stumbling away into the darkness, defeated. The yard was silent again. The crisis had passed. Calloway had made his choice. In front of his men, he had chosen her. He had defended her honor and cast out the man who threatened it. He turned back to Opal, his face softened by a sorrow and a regret that was a decade old. He had rescued her from Jed. And she, by telling him the truth, had given him a path to redemption. She had rescued him from the prison of his own guilt. He reached out and gently took her hand from the saddle horn, his thumb stroking over her knuckles. "Your father was the best man I ever knew," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. He spoke of his daughter, said she had more horse sense in her little finger than his whole damn troop. "He would be so proud of you, Opal." Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time, they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of release. Someone knew. Someone understood. She wasn't a liar or a thief. She was Thomas Quinn's daughter. "He would have liked you," she whispered. Calloway lifted her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it, a gesture of profound respect. "Stay," he said, his voice a raw plea. This was his legacy. "Let me help you honor it. Let me honor him. Stay." It wasn't a job offer, it was a prayer, an invitation home. And looking into the eyes of this broken, beautiful man who understood her past and wanted to be her future, she knew she would. "Yes," she said. Months passed, turning the green of summer into the gold of autumn. The ranch thrived. Jed was a bad memory, and the men who stayed worked with a renewed sense of purpose. Opal was no longer the mysterious widow living in a back room. She was the heart of the Calloway Ranch's horse breeding program. She worked alongside Calloway, her quiet knowledge a perfect complement to his commanding presence. They transformed the ranch, their shared passion for the animals forging a bond deeper than words. The nightmares faded, for both of them. The lonely silences in the main house were replaced by the murmur of conversation over supper, the sound of shared laughter. Opal moved from the small bunk into one of the main house's spare rooms, its window looking out over the corrals. She made it her own with small touches, a jar of wildflowers on the dresser, a braided rug on the floor. Calloway changed. The hard shell around him softened and fell away. He started to talk about the war, about his friend Thomas Quinn, not with guilt, but with a fond, sad reverence. He was healing, and she was the medicine he never knew he needed. He taught her how to read the stars, and she taught him how to laugh again. One evening they sat on the porch swing, a habit they had fallen into, watching the sun set fire to the horizon. A gentle quiet settled between them, comfortable and deep. Her father's saddle had been restored and held a place of honor in the tack room, a silent testament to the past that had brought them together. He reached over and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. It felt natural, right? "I used to sit out here alone every night," he said, his gaze on the distant mountains. "I was waiting. I just didn't know what for." He turned to look at her, his winter sky eyes full of a warmth that melted the last of her fears. "It was you, Opal. It was always you." She leaned her head on his shoulder, the rough fabric of his shirt familiar and comforting. The vast, empty prairie that had once seemed so threatening now felt like a promise, a future stretching out before them, wide and full of hope. He had saved her from a life of lonely desperation, and she had saved him from himself. Here, in the heart of his kingdom, dressed in dust and leather, the discarded widow had finally found her home. This love story was theirs, a tale not of a prince and a pauper, but of two broken souls who, together, became whole.